In the small community of Newtown, Connecticut, lies a vast campus of mostly empty and dilapidated brick buildings, all of which are connected via a now sealed tunnel system. This was Fairfield Hills Hospital, a former psychiatric facility that has been abandoned since the mid-1990s, and it has something of a reputation due to its dark history and eerie atmosphere. So it's probably only human nature that rumors of ghost sightings began to spread among locals to the point that it became recognized nationally. And from there, this abandoned structure found itself as a prominent feature on reality TV. So why was this massive hospital just left to rot? And what are the real stories behind the myths? Stay tuned to find out as we discover the dark tale of the Fairfield Hills Hospital. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. In a sense, this story really starts all the way back in the late 1800s, when psychiatric hospitals, or insane asylums as they were called back then, were the primary solution to people with mental health conditions. These institutions began with the good intentions of providing people struggling in society with a place where they could live and with the help that they needed. However, due to the high demand for the service and chronic underfunding, these institutions did not operate as planned. These asylums would go on to peak around the middle of the 20th century, when, as a result of the two world wars, stressful conditions, and an overall lack of understanding around mental health, there would be around 500,000 Americans institutionalized in hospitals across the country. However, even before this point, American asylums were often overcrowded and lacked sufficient resources due to underfunding. So, in that spirit, facilities in Connecticut were no exception, having only 2 psychiatric hospitals in the entire state. There were Connecticut Valley Hospital and Norwich State Hospital, both of which were already overcrowded. Connecticut Valley was the state's first facility of this type, and it opened in 1868 in Middleton. Although this hospital was large, it became extremely overcrowded because, like I said, it was the only hospital in the state. So years later, in 1904, Norwich State was opened. But there was a problem from the start. Its one building only held 95 patients. This was not nearly enough to meet public demand, and so a second patient building was opened on their campus the following year. This building could host an additional 56 patients, and from there, the cycle of building began. Despite adding numerous buildings in the coming years, there was still never enough to accommodate all the patients who needed care. Then, by the late 1920s, plans were made to build a third facility in Connecticut, which eventually would become the infamous Fairfield Hills. For context, America was suffering extensively from the Great Depression, meaning they were providing mental health care with fewer resources than they had before. Though, despite the economic hardships, the overcrowding at other hospitals had become so extensive that there was no choice, and this time, it would be a much larger facility. This was the moment when leaders brought in architect Walter P. Crabtree to design the sprawling campus. Crabtree was a New York native who primarily worked on his architecture projects in Connecticut. Beyond Fairfield Hills, he left his mark on the state with several other significant works. For example, in 1918, he designed the Ernest R. Burwell House in Bristol, a state classical revival mansion now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. A decade earlier, he had created the Francis H. Holmes House in New Britain, which was an eclectic residence blending multiple influences. We also need to mention his mosaic temple, which stood as one of the most prominent civic commissions. These projects helped cement Crabtree's reputation for versatility, moving seamlessly between private homes, fraternity halls, and grand institutions. Anyhow, the architect decided that the design for the hospital, then known as Fairfield State Hospital, should be Georgian, featuring accented red bricks for the massive rectangular buildings. The campus was designed to create a village-like atmosphere, featuring open lawns and symmetry to promote a therapeutic feel. However, in reality, many felt that it made the area feel more institutionalized and isolating. The original campus comprised several buildings, including administrative buildings, a food hall, and facilities for patient housing. A wide underground network of small, dark tunnels was also dug to connect the different wings. This allowed staff to move patients and equipment between buildings, even in harsh weather, not to mention when there was some unsightly situation that they wanted to keep out of public view. Moreover, like many psychiatric facilities at the time, Fairfield Hills was designed to be self-sustaining, featuring amenities such as a dairy farm, a bakery, an incinerator, and a morgue. Additionally, and this is an important point, the property was so large that there was still ample room to expand the hospital further if needed. Construction began in June of 1931, and just under 2 years later, in June of 1933, the hospital opened its doors and admitted its first patients. Initially, the number of patients was underwhelming for the campus's massive size, with reportedly fewer than 500 when everything began. However, this number is a bit deceiving, as the hospital only had 3 doctors back then, meaning many patients were likely already being overlooked despite their small numbers. In fact, this proportion of each doctor being responsible for over 167 patients should have probably been the first major red flag of the gross medical misconduct to come. And yet, no one seemed to notice. Over the course of the next few decades, the number of patients in the hospital would steadily rise, eventually exceeding 4,000 by the late 1960s. The name was also changed to the now iconic Fairfield Hills around that time. As the number of patients increased, the hospital steadily expanded its campus, eventually reaching a total of 16 buildings at its peak. And it was also around this peak that the people of Connecticut started asking authorities some rather uncomfortable questions about the so-called treatment taking place within the center's walls. Fairfield Hills, as with the majority of psychiatric hospitals of the time, often mistreated and abused its patients. They used inhumane methods of restraint, embraced shock and electroconducive therapy, and in some horrific cases, they went as far as performing frontal lobe lobotomies. In retrospect, we widely recognize that these were hideous procedures, if not crimes against humanity, especially considering the vulnerability of mentally unwell people. That's not even to mention the trust that family members who committed their loved ones to these types of treatments placed in the doctors. Diane Reef, a former psychiatric aide at Fairfield in the 60s, spoke about these practices, saying that patients would come back, and I quote, zombified, or worse, if that's even possible. There were treatments that led to the patient's passing. Beyond that, even those who were lucky enough not to face that type of abuse directly were very unwell, often being transported through the terrifying dark tunnels and witness to things that you and I can't even imagine. And I should probably note that this state of affairs was not at all unique to Connecticut. In fact, things like this were going on all over America. Patients found in these hospitals across the country suffered from a variety of conditions, ranging from extreme mental disabilities to those who were catatonic, although many others were also committed against their will and without proper merit. One of the most haunting examples comes from Illinois, where hospital staff identified an unknown young woman only as Mary Doefor. The name wasn't real. It simply marked her as the 4th unidentified Jane Doe admitted. In truth, she was the victim of a heinous crime, but when she turned to police for help in 1926, instead of receiving justice, she was declared insane and committed. Her family never knew what became of her. For the next 50 years, she lived and then died in state care. She was completely forgotten by the outside world until her death in 1978. Her story is told in the book Marry Me, In Search of a Lost Lifetime by Rick Baker. I read this book about 20 years ago, and although it was so disturbing that I don't even like to talk about it, I think it's worth reading, as it can really help you understand how easily one could disappear into the system back then. In fact, I think I'll follow up with a dedicated episode on that story this weekend, so stay tuned. Nevertheless, many people admitted to these hospitals likely had no actual health issue. Back in this era, One might be submitted to an asylum for things like depression, or, for example, if a woman was simply deemed a difficult wife. There were also many cases of patients being falsely admitted to the hospital, with officials not even considering their side of the story, since the patients were believed to be insane. As a result, many people lived out the rest of their lives in these types of facilities, although occasionally some would escape, causing a loud horn to sound. Nearby residents would sometimes encounter escapees, with one local Newtown woman, Hazel Setter, recalling seeing a naked man on her porch. She held him at gunpoint until he was taken back. With that in mind, by the late 1960s and 70s, a process called Deinstitutionalization began. This process aimed to take psychiatric hospitals, which had gained a reputation for abuse and isolation, and replace them with more community-based mental health services. Unfortunately, after decades of abuse in Fairfield Hills, treatment became more humane due to an increased understanding of mental health conditions. However, over the years, Fairfield Hills also began to see a decline in patient numbers as many other hospitals across the country closed down. Then Connecticut Governor John Rowland decided to shut down the facility, as well as Norwich, in 1995, relocating fewer than 100 of the remaining patients to either a community setting or Connecticut Valley. Locals initially disagreed with the closure out of concern for the local economy, as the hospital had provided many jobs in the community. In total, 484 hospital employees were laid off. Most of them were able to be reassigned to other state jobs, but over 150 people, mostly from food services, janitorial, and healthcare staff, were unable to regain employment and were left entirely out of a job. Now, there were also some people who were concerned that the governor didn't have the patient's best interest in mind, worrying that some would be sent to community settings, despite the fact that they were unable to live independently. Though others argued that the downsizing made sense, citing the fact that the state, which formerly held over 9,000 criminally insane patients, had fewer than 600 at the time of the closure, thanks to the development of community-based programs. And so it was. The hospital shut down, and in the years that followed, the grounds were just left to decay. Much of the furniture used in the hospital, from bathtubs to surgery tables, remained within the buildings, amplifying their already disconcerting aesthetic. Adding to this, according to some sources at least, a few of the rooms still had the blood of patients on the floor. And with these two factors combined, the grim aesthetic and the actual evidence of people being harmed, rumors of the site being haunted began to spread. People theorized that the ghosts of former patients who had suffered and died under the abuse of the hospital remained on its premise. Even without superstition, the reality of what actually unfolded inside of those walls was so horrific that it's not really hard to see why people reached for things like ghost stories. Sometimes it might be easier to explain a thing like suffering through a legend than to confront the full weight of the story. And hence, many people who visited the site claimed to have heard sounds with no discernible source. Others outright reported seeing ghosts on campus. People claimed that the most prominent hauntings were in rooms where procedures such as lobotomies and other inhumane treatments were performed. So, why am I discussing ghost stories? Well, they're oddly important in this case, as they set a trajectory. A chapter of American history marked by tragedy gradually became recast into something else: notoriety. These stories grew to the point that pop culture took over. In 2000, the MTV reality show Fear would put these rumors to test. In Fear, random contestants are brought to a supposedly haunted location, left among themselves with no film crew, and they do dares provided by a computer for 2 nights. Any contestant who remains in the environment wins a prize of $5,000. Fairfield Hills Hospital starred in the second episode of the series under the alias St. Agnes Hospital. The producers gave some locations aliases to protect the site from trespassers. Anyhow, in the Connecticut episode, the contestants were forced to do a variety of dares pertaining to the site's history, such as attempting to contact spirits in the rooms formerly used to lobotomize and torture people. Allegedly, One of the contestants is even made to take a sample of dried blood off the floor of one of the rooms. They also spent much of their time navigating the dark, eerie underground tunnels that connect the various buildings. Finally, by the end of the episode, only 3 of the 5 contestants remain, with 2 having given up their $5,000 to escape the situation entirely. The show concludes with the contestants being asked if they believe that the site was truly haunted. And while one remains skeptical, the other 2 respond affirmatively without hesitation. And while I usually avoid sharing my own opinion in these episodes and try to remain lighthearted about things like entertainment, it's hard not to point out how degenerate this TV show was. They effectively trivialized real suffering, turning tragedy into the backdrop for cheap thrills. That being said, the site's appearance in media has not always been creepy. It's also been used as a filming location in the 1996 film Sleepers, starring Kevin Bacon and Robert De Niro, for example. In that film, the hospital plays the role of a home for boys, a juvenile detention center to which the 4 main characters are sent as children. So what was the side effect of all this notoriety? Well, it wasn't good. The site began to be trespassed and vandalized extensively. And then things went completely crazy when videos of people exploring the site began popping up on the internet. And due to the safety concerns regarding the rise in trespassing, the town entered the premise and sealed off the entrances to all of the underground tunnels, hoping to cut off access to some of the buildings as well. And while the entrances to the tunnels may have been sealed off, the majority of those eerie shafts, they're still down there, sitting in the dark, completely cut off from the rest of the world. For a time, the site was completely abandoned. Once the town acquired the property from the state, it began reutilizing some of the space. A new building was constructed on the property, known as the Newtown Youth Academy, which provides youth with a community center, including a full gym, basketball court, and indoor turf field. From there, the town elected to repurpose Bridgeport Hall as a new municipal center in 2009. Then, in 2014, a $4.5 million ambulance facility was also built on site. But it doesn't end there. There's also a local brewing company called Asylum, located in Stratford Hall, the hospital's former staff dining hall and library. According to the company's website, when they were asked whether or not the campus was haunted, they just answered, "We're not sure." Though the most recent development on the campus happened in early September of 2025. 2 former hospital buildings on site are now being considered for conversion into apartment buildings by a Boston developer who claims that they could potentially accommodate 169 apartments in just the 2 buildings. While some argue that there's too much historical significance in the buildings to repurpose them, many local community members are happy to see these buildings finally being restored and utilized. And fortunately for enthusiasts, while many of the buildings have been torn down or completely reconstructed, a few of the original structures still remain abandoned. Visitors are now welcomed, if not encouraged, to come on campus and view the beautiful, historic, yet abandoned sites from the outside. Today, Fairfield Hills lies somewhere at the crossroads of history and myth. For some people, it's a gut-wrenching reminder of America's troubled past with mental health treatment, a place where thousands of lives once played out in darkness and despair. For others, it's a cultural landmark, preserved through stories of hauntings, pop culture appearances, and widespread rumors that continue to keep its legend alive. So whether you see it as a haunted relic, a cautionary tale of institutional abuse, or simply as a piece of New England history, Fairfield Hills Hospital remains a legend, ensuring its shadowy halls and sealed tunnels will never be forgotten. I will leave it there for today, but until next time, I'm Ryan Sokash, signing off.